Hello, this is Fritz in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And this is Maud in Southern Arizona.
All right, so today's episode is Darmok, which is also from season 5. It looks like season 5 is our
That was a good season.
Is the best season. I mean, almost every episode we've done so far and that we've contemplated doing, they're almost all from season 5. It looks like season 5 was the peak of Star Trek. And so Darmok has been a longtime favorite of mine. It was one I saw years ago. It's always stuck with me. So the plot in this episode is a very simple one. The Enterprise is traveling through the universe, doing their usual. What's your phrase again, Maud?
They're putzing around looking for alien life forms.
Exactly, putzing around looking for alien life forms, and they encounter the legendary children of Tama, who have apparently only been encountered once before by another Enterprise, by another Starfleet vessel. And apparently the other Starfleet vessel said that they were incomprehensible, that they were unable to establish communication. And so they open up a channel to the other vessel, and the other vessel starts speaking in phrases that the Enterprise cannot understand, saying things like Shaka when the walls fell and Darmok. We in the Enterprise can see the captain of the other vessel having a dispute with his first officer, his Riker, pretty much. So it's their Picard arguing.
Notice it's the same kind of personality too.
Yeah, right. Riker.
I mean, the Enterprise. That's
another thing we can talk about is how Riker's really. We picked all of his worst episodes, it seems. But anyway, so that those two are having a debate about something, and they're shouting at one another, and finally the captain takes two daggers, his dagger and his dagger of his first officer, and holds him up and says, Darmok and Jalad Antanagra, or something like that. And then at that very moment, him and Picard are transported to the surface of the planet. This is where it becomes kind of this pseudo gladiatorial scenario, which is what we're all prepared for. So the audience, the Star Trek audience, has been, has witnessed multiple gladiatorial scenarios going back to the original Star Trek with Kirk and Spock. And so here we are, we're thinking, the first time I watched it, I was thinking, this looks like it's going to be, mano a mano between Picard and the captain of the Children of Tama. And Picard thinks that, right? So Picard is, now on the surface of the planet with this other guy, his counterpart, and the counterpart tries to shove the knife at him, offer the knife to him. He's offering it to him, but Picard thinks that he's offering it to him in order to force, them to have single combat, and Picard rejects it. So Picard's like, I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to fight you. Get out. I don't want to fight. This is not the way we should do things. So initially Picard resists this, and Picard just sets himself apart. The other guy's obviously frustrated. And then the night falls and the fight, they huddle around. They're kind of sharing a fire. Both, Picard is still very sort of suspicious. And this guy says Tembo with his arms open, and presents him with with a flaming branch in order to share the fire with Picard. And that's when Picard begins to realize that maybe there's something metaphorical about this communication process, and that arms open is his gesture of benevolence and sharing. And we as the audience can also pick up on that, because it's a kind of a universal gesture of sharing, or receptivity. So that's when the light bulb goes off in Picard's head, and Picard's like, okay, so this is all about metaphor, but I don't understand your metaphors. How are we gonna get past this point? And that's pretty much the whole episode from that point on. Data eventually figures out that the children of Tama are using a referential language, that their entire form of communication is through references to their mythology.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah, the way and I think Crusher or somebody said, well, yeah, it was Riker, our buddy Riker was the one who said, well, great, so now let's start talking to him. He goes, no, it's not that easy, because what you've done is you've figured out the grammar, you know how they speak, but without knowing the mythology, it's like knowing the grammar of a language but not knowing the vocabulary.
Riker's crew on the Enterprise is trying to beam the captain back, and they inadvertently almost succeed at the worst possible moment, right? So they're able to halfway transport the captain at the very moment when the creature's attacking, and Picard wants to help the captain Dathan. He wants to help Dathan. He wants to work together with him to defeat the common enemy as intended by the scenario. And yet at that very moment, he's unable to, because his people are pulling him back to Riker's pulling him back to the Enterprise. And yet they fail to pull him back entirely. So he's back on the planet. Yet at this point, the captain of the other ship, has been mortally wounded, and that's where it becomes very kind of the pathos is introduced to the show, and that guy lies kind of dying, and at that moment Picard kind of tells him the story of Gilgamesh as a way of as a way of sharing some of the human mythology that Picard rightly guesses that this other creature can relate to. That Picard shows him that, hey, we have a similar kind of
and the whole
heritage.
Time he's telling that story, the other captain is just laughing and smiling,
chuckling,
and really enjoying the story.
Yeah. So, and the other actor does a great job, despite all the makeup, and everything. He does a tremendous job, I think, of showing the frustration of trying to communicate and not being able to, as well as the joy and relief at being able to communicate even a little bit. And so that's it. The guy lies dying by the fire as Picard tells him the story of Gilgamesh, and then the guy passes away. And at that point, finally the barrier is lifted, and they're by the other ship, so that both ships are able to retrieve their captains. Now, this is a little bit odd because the other ship doesn't really seem to hold the Enterprise accountable for the death of their captain, right? I mean, it was sort of the interference of Riker that led to the failure of the
I don't know why
the mission.
Is that at that point when they brought him back, they were about to have a big war with the humans.
Yeah, right, exactly. They were holding him accountable. You're right. And so, but the way it was resolved at that point by by Picard was fairly underdeveloped. So Picard just basically holds out the knives.
So we went from we're about to have a World War 8 or 10 or whatever we're at.
Yeah.
To we're best buddies, simply because Picard was able to communicate with them.
Yeah, but his communication was very limited, right? I mean, all he did was say, he did the Temba with arms open, and and he reused a few of the phrases that he had learned.
I bought that. I buy that. I mean, when you're not able to communicate at all, when somebody speaks your language, even if it's 2 or 3 memorized words or phrases, you feel some sort of bonding to them.
Absolutely.
And I feel much closer.
No, I totally agree with you. And that is one of the observations I was about to make myself. That's one of the kind of the beyond the episode observations that I want to go into.
What did you get out of that episode?
Well, just what you mentioned. You kind of jumped, you stole my thunder to some degree, which was.
Well, you can always go back and cut it out.
No. I mean, it's no. I agree with you. You and I have both traveled, and one of the benefits of traveling one of the lessons you learn is kind of how much we take communication for granted if we don't travel, right? So if we're within our own community and there are no barriers to communication with people who speak our own language, we just take communication completely for granted. And when we're in a situation where communication is difficult, then we learn to appreciate how special communication is, verbal communication or
right, and it's
or
really not
nonverbal.
just the meaning,
And
right? It's not just. Yeah, go ahead. Finish what you were saying.
Well, we appreciate how just any communication, to some degree, there's an inverse rule. It's like the more difficult it is, the more difficult it is to communicate something, the more satisfaction you have when you actually do, communicate it. And so when you're in a foreign,
if you want to give a background to our viewers, is when we were in college, we traveled through Europe together on a bike. And I don't know if you recall this episode, but we were in an island, I think in Sardinia. We were at it was like a little fishing village. And we found a fisherman. Neither of us spoke Italian, right? You didn't speak Italian.
Well, no.
Yeah, a few words. You spoke a few words. So there was a fisherman there. We ended up talking to the guy, and we ended up having an entire meal. Imagine having an entire meal with this guy. He cooked us up some spaghetti. And if we ever got across something as simple as, man, the weather is really good, everybody would be like, oh, yes, the weather is good. Everybody's just
exactly
that we understood each other, because you have this moment of shared being. They have, everybody's in their own little world. And for this one moment, even though we're across the world from each other, we come from completely different universe, basically. In this one moment, we occupied the same space together, as we were both in the space of, isn't the weather great? Do you remember that incident?
Well, no, I absolutely remember. We gathered clams. We went with him on the beach, and we gathered a whole bunch of clams, I believe, for the most part. And then he added them to a spaghetti and served spaghetti, and we did communicate.
And we had entire conversations on the most superficial level, and yet it was so fulfilling, because anytime you communicated, you felt
and that was my experience for the most part in Russia. When I spent most of 2004 to 2008 in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and I learned to speak Russian to a certain degree, but not very well. I mean, I was communicative, and I could shop, and I could negotiate for rides, because they had, like, in Russia at the time, you just would flag down any car, and then you would have to, like, everybody was a potential cab driver. Yeah, everybody was a potential cab driver.
Everybody's an Uber driver.
It was pre-Uber, and everybody, lots of people just moonlighted driving around town. And if you flagged them down, they would stop, and they'd roll down their window, and you would tell them where you wanted to go, and then you would haggle over the price. So I was able to do that. I'm saying I could do that type of haggling and day-to-day stuff. But when I met people conversationally, we would just talk about our lives, and I would wind up saying the same sort of my life story over and over again with different people, and they would tell me. And it was, but you wind up appreciating those small victories, if you will, the minor every little successful communication was to some degree of victory, and it was special. It made daily existence special. It made just going to going to buy bread, or going to the market and buying something from a stall was a little adventure, and full of, there were,
because you realize how difficult language is at that moment. And like you said, how everybody takes it for granted. Right. And yet it really is difficult. Language is an immensely difficult thing. One reason I like this episode was Arabic is very similar to the children of the Tarma language, because so when people try to learn Arabic, it's considered one of the hardest languages to learn. When people try to learn it, they do what I did, because I lived abroad most of my life, and even growing up, I grew up in an American compound in Saudi Arabia where everybody spoke English. So Arabic, even though it was the first language I learned, it quickly became my second language. So I almost had to relearn Arabic when I went back to visit my family in Palestine. And so I would memorize the vocabulary. I knew the vocabulary. I even knew the grammar. But I still came across as a foreigner in moments. And it wasn't until much later that I realized why I came across as a foreigner. It's because Arabic is a very, I don't know if you want to call it metaphorical. I don't know if you call it allegorical, but everything in Arabic refers to God, religion. So if you want to come across as a native Arab, it is so easy. You just have to learn 20 phrases, just memorize 20 phrases, and people will look at you sideways like it's a natural language to you. And you just know these phrases, you just throw them in, like the word for thank you, if you study Arabic, is shukran. Nobody ever says shukran who's native. Only foreigners say shukran. Because what you say if you're an Arab native, especially if you're like old school, if you want to really be grassroots, you would say, God grant your children a long life. You would never say thank you. That'd just be like, well, that's kind of formal, And you get these older generation people who will rattle off like 20 phrases for thank you. God give your children many children. God lengthen the life of your mother, and just go on and on with these phrases, and everything. And so very little is literally the word you'd see in the dictionary. Like time is another example, and yeah, if you ask somebody questions about are we going to go on time? If you ask a bus driver if you're going to go on time, I can tell you what the answer is going to be. It's going to be inshallah, which is God willing.
God willing,
yeah, God willing. And it's totally depends on the context what it means. Typically inshallah means no way in hell. Like if your kids say, hey, can I have a pony, they'll say inshallah, which means, yeah, forget it. It's not going to happen. If you ask a bus driver, are we leaving on time? If he says inshallah, you better find another way to get to where you want to go if you want to get there soon. Because inshallah could be hours, it could be 5 minutes. But that's if you want to appear like a native Arab, it has very little to do with the vocabulary. You are much better off not knowing the vocabulary, knowing nothing about the vocabulary, just memorizing key phrases that a native would speak that are, Darmok and Jalad, kind of phrases. Just memorize those phrases and throw them in instead of the one word that you'd find in the dictionary. Would change completely people's perspective of you, because it's not just getting across the idea, right? That's the children of Tamar. What are they?
Tama. Tama. Tama.
Tama. The children of Tama. They relate to each other, not just to get an idea across. They communicate to share an experience, right? They're sharing the mythology and the legacy, and the fact that, who I am today is based on all this shared legacy that we have, that we understand each other, not just what we're trying to get across is give me that. And I find Germanic languages to be very, give me this, thank you. Just whatever words you find in the dictionary, if you use them, people say, oh, you speak German so well, you speak English so well, because you're just using the right words at the right time. Foreign languages are typically much more colorful, that they don't want you to just say thank you. They want you to express some shared experience of gratitude, something like that. That the words thank you would seem, really dry and formal.
Yeah. Yeah,
Is
I mean,
Portuguese like that?
uh, well, Portuguese in Brazil is the one thing I will say about it, which is I think appropriate for this discussion, is there is the difference between the official Portuguese and the colloquial Portuguese, and then the even more relaxed kind of slang, right? So there's almost three, or common, you might call it common, colloquial, and written. So there's written Portuguese or official Portuguese, and then there's the colloquial Portuguese, which is the kind of used by most people day in and day out, and then there's the kind of abbreviated or slangy Portuguese that people use with their friends and whatnot. And what I have found is sort of one of my difficulties, or not difficulties, one of my frustrations is getting past the bias of the educated people that don't want, that are ashamed of that are sort of like language snobs, right? So the people that are educated or consider themselves educated that I interact with, and I'll oftentimes ask them about, to clarify certain things or how to say something, or I'll ask them if I'm constantly seeking feedback and constantly saying, did I say that right, or should I say it a different way? And a lot of times they'll be like, there's two common responses. One is, don't worry about it because we Brazilians don't even speak Portuguese properly. And that's one response that they'll always say. And then they'll oftentimes say, well, here's the proper way to say it. And then my response to them is, well, I don't want to know the proper way. Well, I say, right, I want to know both the proper way to say it and the informal or colloquial or familiar way to say it. And they're like, why? And I'm like, because that's the way the language is. That's actually where the language is going. And this is the part that, they don't understand. And you see this in all languages. There's this kind of protectionist attitude amongst the educated people, or the people think they're educated, which frustrates the hell out of linguists, because linguists realize that language is always changing, always changing, minute by minute, practically. It's one of the most fluid things in our social universe. And yet most people who spend their entire life thinking that language is static, and some people go to, or think of themselves as being in a battle to preserve the language against against being degraded, in their words, by change. And so you have a lot of people who constantly complain that language is being degraded by the youth, or by the undereducated, or whatever, by popular usage.
That is pretty universal.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so there's this universal, as we're saying, there's this universal defense of the status quo within language by the power. It's really a power differential thing, which is kind of underappreciated, I think, to some degree. People, right now, so much of the public discourse is about power differential, but this is a power differential that really exists, and it's kind of underappreciated. So you have the powers, the educated people, you rely on this to kind of establish their own status, right? They're like, well, we speak the official educated language of the properly, so that establishes us as higher status. They don't say it that way, but that's actually what they're doing, and they denigrate the people who don't use it.
It's far more noticeable in Palestine, because you have very distinct language used by the, quote, peasants. They call them peasants. It's the farmers. They're called fallahi. And in fact, if you use fallahi terms, they use cha instead of qa, for example. People will think it's funny, and they'll ridicule you. and I think it's funny because I think it's amazing. I think it's funny the same way. Uh, what was that movie? My cousin Vinny,
Yeah.
the Utes, the
Yeah.
Utes. Yeah. So to me, that was awesome, right? That was great that he said the Utes, the
Yeah.
Utes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so, and some people would look at it as like, oh, he's not, he needs to enunciate better, and for me, and that's the same way I look at Palestinian um, speech is when people speak in the peasant tongue, I think it's hilarious and I think it's wonderful. And I think it's unique because it's not grammatical, it's all just familiar. People talking with each other, coming up with these dialects, which is very rich, right? Because it's got so much more into it besides just the science of grammar. It's got some kind of influence from who knows where Utes came from, instead of people saying Utes. But it's wonderful, and people in Palestine don't see it that way. They think when I try to speak the familiar peasant language, they think I'm trying to make fun of them. Like my mother will castigate me. It's like, oh, you don't say that. People will hear you. It's like people love it. The farmers, when they hear me speak like that, they love it. That, oh my gosh, he's speaking farmer. That's amazing. So it is a very snotty approach, and it's like you said, it's universal. It's far more. I mean, it's in the U.S. You see it with Southern dialects. The people look down on a Southern dialect as somehow being lower. The quote urban dialect. I think those are wonderful when you use guys and stuff like that. I think all that language is great, and I think it helps us connect with each other in ways that pure grammar, speaking grammatically and enunciating, doesn't connect us the same way.
Well, it's not just. So you're speaking to some degree about the kind of the poetic quality of these alternative for vocabularies and alternative dialects, which I totally agree with. And a lot of there's a kind of inherent poetry in this stuff, the way new phrases are turned and actually it all comes down to, a lot of it comes back to metaphor. A lot of times where, there are words used in a metaphoric fashion that become, is a form of creativity. It's a form of extending.
Like in southern metaphors are famous,
brilliant,
right?
Yeah. They're
like cold as a toad's nuts or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know any of them, but they could rattle off a bunch of them like that.
Well, right. I mean, the interesting thing about metaphor, and now we're going a little, I'm deviating. I want to come back to something eventually, but just quickly, the one thing that's funny about metaphor, I was realizing, is it's very hard to think of metaphors outside of a context. Like within a context, one just uses them; they just come out naturally, as you speak. Yeah. But if you're put on the spot and somebody says, "Hey, tell me some metaphors," you're like, cold as ice. But you can't really. It's hard to come up with metaphors. It's the same problem with doing what I call the reverse lookup in general. So did we talk about this already on a previous discussion about reverse lookups?
Not the reverse lookup.
Reverse lookup coming from a computing perspective. So you can do what I refer to as reverse lookup. So again, this comes back to my day-to-day experience in Brazil, what I'm kind of fine-tuning my language experience. And so a lot of times I'll be searching for the word in Portuguese, and I know the word will exist, and I know it's but I'm a little bit unsure. I can't recall it perfectly. So I'll ask the person I'm talking to, I'll define the word that I'm looking for. Perfect. I'll define it in a way that they know what I mean. Like I'll be like, that round
what is
thing.
The word that means this?
That round thing that fits into that square thing. And they're like, oh yeah, I know.
It sounds like.
Yeah, and they're like, I know what it is. And there'll be two reactions. One reaction is, I know what it is, but I can't remember the word myself. This is from a native. They're like, yeah, I know what it is, but I can't remember. Or they'll be like, no, we don't have such a word. And I'm like, yes, you do have such a word. You do. You must have such a word. Most of the time, it's because I know that the word exists in Latin, and any word in Latin, or because English, Latin overlap. And I'm like, yes, you must have the word. It's in Latin and therefore it's in Portuguese. And they're like, no, no, no. And finally, well, I'm like, okay, all right, you got to go to Google. So we go to Google, we look it up, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's the word. So what I realized is that people in general are just poor at doing a reverse lookup when you give them the definition and ask them for the word.
Hmm.
The
You mean their conscious mind is? Their subconscious mind is doing that every second, every millisecond. They're doing a reverse lookup.
Well, is that true?
And when you're
speaking, are you doing a reverse lookup? Or yeah,
you're doing a reverse lookup, but you're doing it subconsciously. So what you're describing to me is the fact that your conscious mind is not designed for reverse lookups.
Right.
It's designed for lookups, and your subconscious is designed for instantaneously, virtually doing reverse lookups.
Pretty much, yeah, exactly. I didn't think about it in those terms, but exactly right. I mean, we're very good. Our conscious mind is very good at doing a regular lookup. So if I give you a word, if I give you the word, you can give me the definition, you know. But if I give you the definition and ask you for the word, it's a much lower hit rate, you know. So anyway, so that's,
I think your mind is compartmentalized that way. I think your conscious mind has taken on the role of doing lookups.
Well, it makes sense because of the way the communication works. I'm doing lookups to understand your speech.
You don't have time. You don't have time. And this, as a non-native speaker, you see what happens when you try to translate, when you try to take a word and figure out what it means with your conscious mind, because that's why non-natives take so long to speak, is they're constantly doing these reverse lookups,
right?
And you're consciously, and it just takes forever.
Slow, yeah.
And a native speaker does it all on the subconscious level. Right. They're just doing these reverse lookup after reverse lookup in a millisecond. So until you can do it subconsciously, you're always going to be slow.
Well, yeah, it's hard to say whether, I mean, I don't know if we are doing reverse lookups or whether we're just retrieving words in a sense, you know, without doing a lookup, so to speak.
So I wonder, I mean, you do it every day. So what is happening when you want to speak in Portuguese? Does your subconscious, this is what may be happening. I mean, it'd be curious to see what the algorithm is in your head.
Mm-hmm.
But what may be happening is your subconscious takes whatever concept you want to articulate and converts it to English words for you. So it does the reverse lookup in English. Then your conscious mind takes those words and says, okay, let me do a lookup into my Portuguese dictionary. Right. And see because I'm good at that. So it's still pretty fast. I mean, when a non-native speaks a foreign language, it's still relatively fast. It's nowhere near as fast as a native. There's a lot of ums and ahs thrown in there while your conscious mind does this lookup. But I think that does explain how translation works, is your subconscious does a reverse lookup into your native language. Then your conscious takes the native language, does a lookup. Your subconscious takes an idea and reverse looks up into your native language. That's what your subconscious is amazing at. Your conscious mind takes that word in your native language and looks it up in the language you want to translate it to.
Well, I think it depends on the level of fluency. So, I mean, obviously, in your case, you're bilingual, so you're not doing that back and forth from Arabic and in English.
I mean, it took a while now I can subconsciously do reverse lookups in Arabic. But for when I was rusty, I was doing a reverse lookup into English, then doing a lookup into Arabic.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in my case, it depends on the situation, depends on the level of the conversation. And I think I do a mixture of both. I think some things just come out of me automatically in Portuguese without hesitation. And sometimes, particularly habitual things, right? Habitual things come out spontaneously. Well, and this is, by the way, but this is interesting. This is, I want to mention this while we're on it. This is where there are different forms of speech, and how different forms of speech, in particular swearing, is much more automatic. and much more, than kind of technical speech. So that's why I think most people this is a sort of understudied aspect of language, I suspect, is the neurological underpinnings of curse words and swearing compared to other speech. Because I think we mentioned before how Tourette's people who have Tourette's syndrome, they curse, and also, like, there's very few, like, the only word I know from German that I use regularly is scheißen. And I only, because it's a swear word that means shit.
Yeah.
And it just seems like it's one of those words that just seems to fit what it means, right? It just seems like a good swear word, and certain swear words are just better swear words than others.
Swears. I mean, you bring up a point, is that if you're bilingual or somewhat bilingual, you can cherry pick the best phrases for a different situation.
Sure.
And I see Arabs doing that a lot, is like taking these really cool, like LOL, that kind of works. It's an English thing, laugh out loud. They adopted that in Arabic because they don't have anything anywhere near as concise and to the point. But there's lots of things like, but swear words is a good example, because some of my favorite swear words are in Hindi. But anyways, and that's like the only words I know in Hindi.
Yeah, so swear words and slang. And this is where I want to go back to I'm finally circling back to the point I didn't get to make earlier when we were talking about kind of the official language or versus colloquial language, and the snobbery. What I wanted to say is that not only are the people who are language snobs and sort of language conservatives, not only are they kind of being snobbish, if you will, and kind of unduly proud of something that they don't really need to be so proud of, but they're really wrong, because in many cases at least, the things that they consider to be errors in the colloquial speech are really just forerunners of where the language is headed in the future, and what will eventually be the official speech in the future. So the
error, the official speech at one point was an error.
Correct, or was a deviation from the previous official speech, and then so eventually it became adopted as the proper form, and over time it becomes somebody else's.
There's nothing special.
Somebody in the future will then defend that as being the proper way to do it. So they're basically unknowingly defending things which were previously denigrated as being inferior and degradations.
With the claim under the claim that this is the correct way to speak.
Correct. Right. Yeah.
and there's nothing correct about it. It's just
right.
It's just what we happen to be speaking about now. There's nothing objectively correct about it.
Exactly. And a lot of errors,
especially in English,
a lot of things that people consider to be errors in the colloquial speech are really the speaker applying a rule they're applying a rule properly in a context where that rule isn't normally used, but the rule does make linguistic sense. I mean, this has been mentioned many times as a way of defending Ebonics, if you will, that some phrases or turns of phrase in Ebonics are actually grammatically proper, but it's just that they're not ordinarily used. They're not part of the official speech, but they are linguistically proper. They are grammatically proper or grammatically as proper. And the same thing happens to me in Portuguese. A lot of times I'll apply a certain rule that actually Brazilians don't use. And then I learn the hard way that I'm using, especially when it comes to suffixes, like, Portuguese is full of suffixes. Most languages are suffix and prefix driven, I think, to some degree, a lot of degrees. So Portuguese has a lot of suffixes. In fact, maybe that's one of the challenges. I think they have more suffixes, so there's this. So the way that you would indicate kind of whether a person is a, like the way you can indicate occupation or profession is by adding, a suffix to the word, like, ista or door. So like, motorista is a driver, right? So motorista. And door is another form. So you can have trabalhador, meaning a worker. Trabalhar is to work, and trabalhador is worker. But you might find, I could say, well, why don't we have moderador, instead of motorista, or why not trabalhista instead of trabalhador? And so sometimes I'll mistakenly use the wrong suffix, but I don't want to apologize for it. I want to basically celebrate it, because I'm like, hey, that's cool.
Look, I just made up a word.
Yeah, I made up a word, but it's a legitimate word. It would, if there was a linguist here, he would defend me. He would say, hey, that guy's applying the right rule, even though it's not the.
He butchered the language.
Butchering it. But butchering it is, and that's the funny thing, because butchering it is almost, one person's butchering is another person's poetry.